So welcome everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. My name's David Wood. I chair London Futurists and I am co-hosting this event with Rohit Talwar, who is the CEO of Fast Future. And this event is also being supported by the Millennium Project UK node and by the Icelandic Centre for Future Studies. So thanks to them and thanks to their support also for this survey. Let's have a quick look at where we are. We've already had one session last week where we introduced some of the results from the survey. We looked at when might AGI arrive, where and who might it come from, what are the clearest positive and negative outcomes that are likely, and what are the economic impacts. And in case you missed that and you want to catch up with it, you can find recordings on the YouTube channel of Fast Future Publishing. Today, we're moving on from that, and we're going to look at outcomes for individuals and society, outcomes for government, outcomes for business, and then some implications. What skills should we prioritize for ourselves and for others? What approaches could we take towards governing the rise of AGI? And then an exploration of points raised at the end of the survey by people who wanted to suggest future directions. Rohit, over to you.
So just to give you a feel, some of you may not have been here last week, we had respondents from 42 countries, so that's about 20% of all the countries on the planet, biased towards the UK and US, but a pretty good representation from most continents. So it was nice to know that we had a good global spread of input. In terms of professions who took part, then inevitably there are quite a significant number who are from forward-looking professions, whether it's futurists or scientists, business leaders, academics, and then a very wide range of professions falling under that other category. In total, we had 199 responses, which was very encouraging given that I think we were hoping for 200. So we were only one out, which is pretty good.
So let's get started with looking at some of the responses. And this chart shows what respondents thought were the most likely outcomes from AGI for individuals and society. And you can see there is no strong consensus here. There is a wide variety of views, some pessimistic and some optimistic, but usually even the pessimism had some optimism included and the optimism had some pessimism included too. In terms of a strong view that looks like a lot of worry about people feeling detached, people not being able to participate in the full benefits of AGI, people lacking a sense of purpose if AGI is able to do everything that humans currently value in themselves. And even in things like the possibilities for robot companions, which some people saw as a benefit, others were worried, saying, well, what about the protection of individual privacy? Any remarks shared with your individual robot companion, who is going to know about them and take advantage of them? In terms of some more positive feedback, the possibilities for widespread worldwide education to levels never achieved before means that in principle, more people should be able to apply their skills in helping to resolve the main challenges ahead of us, including existential threats. Other people referred to the famous saying by Arthur C. Clarke that the goal of the future is full unemployment so that we can play. Or somebody else suggested we could become like 17th century kings, queens, and emirs, living lives of leisure, but without all the cholera. Another suggestion is that we could become radical artists. Yet again, there were responses that even questioned the setting. Somebody said, well, you're talking about individuals and society, but will these concepts still hold up once AGI starts reaching a state of progress? What's going to happen to our education, legal systems, and so on? In terms of how we could prepare, the comments in this question mirrored the comments in many other questions, that we had to get ahead of the difficult changes. We had to teach people about the possibilities for AI. We had to learn from the lessons from previous industrial revolutions, which was a technological change caused vast amounts of pain as well as vast amounts of progress. And there was some skepticism about what might be possible. People pointed out that we weren't making a very good job of adapting to other changes, such as greenhouse gas emissions or deforestation of rainforests. So this is not going to be an easy thing to tackle. Anything to add, Rohit?
Yeah, just a couple of points. With all of these things that where we talk about the implications, one of the things that has come through very strongly is this sense of, well, who is funding the development? Who is bringing this to the market? Because their motivations and their potential paybacks will really determine a lot of these things. So if it's seen to be for-profit organizations, then some of the more beneficial things that we can see here may not be the top of their priority list. A second factor to consider is a lot of people again pointed out that much of what we're talking about throughout the survey in terms of positive outcomes are things that we could and should be doing today, but there isn't enough incentive, whether it's from government, business, or society. There isn't enough incentive to tackle those things. And AGI won't necessarily come in and do that for us if we're not inclined to do that. And then the third point underpinning all of this again is understanding. How well prepared are we for what might be coming in terms of our understanding of what AGI is, why it's coming to market, how it's being developed, what it will be able to do, what its implications might be, and how we might deal with unintended or negative consequences through regulation and oversight. So a very broad set of questions were raised about these things throughout the study, and we're just going to try and drop those in as we go along. I would also encourage you to put any questions you've got in the Q&A box so that we can pick those up. Let's move on and look at the next question then, which is the implications for government. And as you can see, the top one was that maybe we'll just get better at the government process, the process of leading, that we'll get better and more consistent policy making, more consistent translation of policy into action, and more consistent execution of action. That if we have rigorous processes that basically bypass things that are currently driven by polls and emotion and have a more consistent voter-driven decision-making process that's more transparent using things like DAOs, then that could be far more trusted. But also this starts to raise questions about, well, what is the role of government? Do we need it? Do we need the party system? So really raising some quite big questions. And then some questions about, well, where would this come to market first? Where would we start to use it? And some believing that actually it would be single party states that would do this, in which case their motivations might not just be about the greater social good, but there might be an element of social control there. And then that leads into the questions of whether some governments might use it to pursue more authoritarian mechanisms or behaviors, might increase the level of citizen surveillance, and we might have more intrusion in our life rather than AGI protecting us. And again, this issue of understanding and awareness amongst politicians is key. And then this question of whether turkeys will vote for an early Christmas, because an awful lot of this takes power out of the hands of government. And then one final point I want to just pick up was that it was also reflected on that if we move from artificial general intelligence to artificial superintelligence that's actually smarter than us, and that journey could happen quite quickly because AGI starts to learn and evolve, then that would basically rule all bets off. We don't really know what the outcomes would be, but it seems unlikely that any artificial superintelligence would look at current government and governance models and say they're the best way forward. So we could see something quite radical emerge at that level. And then the question that sort of arises out of all this is, what kind of level do we want citizen participation at? Is it local level with AGI? Is it national level? Or would this rise up to the supranational level? And then that raises the question of how you regulate. And would we have multiple different AGIs in different countries, each trying to collaborate, or would they be part of one bigger global AGI? And then who sits behind it and whose motivations, whose biases, whose preferences would drive that, the design of that AGI and the governance of it? David, anything you'd like to add there?
So there's clearly interest in the survey about alternative governance models using things like DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations. But there were also questions that said, help us to understand this more fully. How could these things really change if we have more intelligent AI helping out? So that's a possible future task for us, to try to put more effort into seeing how government at the local and national or even international level could be transformed with this combination of AI and distributed technology. And then on the topmost voted issue there, the possibility of improved analysis and modeling of policy scenarios, that seems like a very strong positive outcome, but there was some worries that it's a bit like having a very clever lawyer. The lawyer can see all kinds of possibilities and help you to achieve whatever you want to achieve. And there is the risk that if the politicians are still pursuing self-centered motivations or other ill motivations, the rigorous modeling and analysis would serve them rather than truly serve humanity. So we've got our work cut out there as well.
Okay.
Let's move on and then talk about the implications for business. And there was a reasonably clear consensus here, which is that things are going to be significantly different, not just a little bit different. There will be a massive reinvention of every industry and sector, was one common viewpoint. Some people went even further, more than just massive. There would be no need for employees in these companies of the future. It will just be owners and their AGIs acquiring wealth for them. So that's a bigger possible change. Then there were lots of comments as to how to prepare for this possible change in business. Some people were advocating, well, let's hurry up and learn. Those who learn about these possibilities will do well. The others will be left behind, scrapping for some small crumbs off the table. Other people weren't so sure. They said, frankly, it's difficult to get our heads around AGI. The change is already fast. Imagining that people can go be ahead of it is a big ask. Just having more employees asked to look after this, as in a slacker, more resilient organizational framework, may not be sufficient. There may be a need for hiring well-paid, truly competent experts to give to companies the advantage which is for them. And one final set of comments, the risk of many people losing lots of money in getting overexcited too soon on possible AGI breakthroughs. A possible crash of a bubble, similar to what happened with the dot-com collapse at the end of the 1990s, the start of the 2000s. The technology was good in the end, but there was a lot of premature excitement, and there are risks of people losing money, potentially losing a great deal of money in investing in the wrong companies at the wrong time. So again, it's a call for wiser discernment. What would you add, Rohit?
Well, a few things here. One is we can't just make the assumption that AGI is going to run everything. There will be an awful lot of places where people may even backlash against the technology and want humans designing, delivering the service, the experience for us. So a very simple example, we now have a lovely Turkish bakery here in Golders Green. I don't want an AGI involved in that. I don't want something that knows that when I have a Turkish breakfast, I don't want any meat in it. I'm quite happy for the humans to do that. I'm quite happy to look in the kitchen and know that I'm never going to get exactly the same thing every time, that I might get a bit more feta cheese or less or whatever, depending on how they're feeling that day. I love that humanity. And I think there will be an awful lot of places where people will desire and want to pay for humanity. The second thing is that if you look at a lot of these points, particularly the top four, They're about a fundamental rethinking enabled by technology. And the question there is, whilst the futurists, the future thinkers, the AI professionals are seeing this as a possibility and potentially a desirable possibility, if we look at the business leaders, point 5, we know that they're not yet there yet. And that's what could hold this back again. The lack of understanding, and also a desire maybe not to go there because it's so far outside their understanding that the current generation of business leaders may well think, you know what, let me retire, let me get out of the way before you do this, and let me just hold it back for as long as I can. And then the final piece I would add is, a lot of this is very exciting from a technological point of view, a sociological point of view, a new economy perspective. But we have to think of the other side of this, that yes, if we go to autonomous vehicles and we automate trucking, we automate the taxi industry, delivery industry, all those that rely on transport, that's millions and millions of people who lose their jobs. And the chances are they're going to lose their jobs before we've thought about what we do in response. And so this is where we need to make sure we're thinking now about that in advance and getting the retraining programs, the job support programs, the guaranteed income programs in place so that we can help people transition either to new roles elsewhere or to starting their own business, or to that mindset shift that says, now we're giving you infinite leisure. Let's help you find the way that you want to fulfill yourself in the best possible way with infinite leisure time.
One quick comeback, if I may, regarding whether humans will choose to interact with humans when they could have their services instead provided by an AI. I think the history of this is ambiguous. There were people who said initially that when there were holes in the wall where you could get money from the bank, they would prefer to go and see a human bank teller because of the human interaction. Well, that didn't last very long. I also remember a very influential article published about 1994, 1995 that said e-commerce would never take off because humans want to talk to humans when they're making a purchase. The idea of buying significant things through a heartless, mindless web page was deemed to be just a techno fantasy. So in both cases, humans change their approaches. So I look forward to mapping this out further.
Next time you're in Golders Green, David, I'll take you to the bakery and you tell me if you're going to be happy with robots doing it. Okay, so then let's move on and look at the next question, which is about skills. So this was a really interesting one. A broad understanding that we need to equip society, and in different ways. So one view is that as well as helping people understand what AGI is, how it could be used, what its impacts could be, how we might need to regulate it, we also need people to have that broader contextual awareness. So whether it's science fiction or training in the classics, a deeper understanding of history, of ethics, of what some of society's grand challenges are and the issues that we're not tackling today, to put AGI in a bigger context. And all of that is fundamental to helping people understand what AGI could mean for us in our world and how it could play out. And that drives it into the schooling curriculum, well beyond AGI itself, to understanding the world we're moving into. Then there's an interesting conversation in the commentary as well about part of that understanding is to get people to think about, well, what are the alternatives then? If we start to have AGI and it starts to free us up, give us more leisure time, what could that mean? Could that mean that it actually starts to give us the freedom to take away fear, to make more productive choices around what we want with our lives rather than seeing ourselves as economic units of production? Could it allow us to find more in spiritual enrichment, to look at our leisure time as something that allows us to pursue a path of personal development and growth and of contribution to society? And then there's a broader piece, which is, okay, if we're going to coexist alongside AGI, then what do we need as humans to survive and thrive that world? And I'm going to read these out because it's a really interesting list of ideas that came through around things like generalist interdisciplinary thinking, understanding more about what fairness means in this new world, justice, self-love, self-worth, self-actualization, how to resist being dehumanized by the technology, how to be rational in this world where the machine is making a lot of decisions, how to think in big picture terms, how to do critical thinking and systems thinking, how to collaborate, how to do teamwork, how to solve problems, how to recognize the bigger picture systemic and existential risks we face, and then look at those in terms of, well, how could AGI help us? And then becoming much more discerning around spotting fakes and lies, whether it's images or text, but starting to question what we're seeing, even if it's presented by the AGI. When we talk about jobs, obviously that understanding of how to become more entrepreneurial and create our own job. And finally, this idea that all of us need to become futurists to some extent and learn how to do some aspects of future study. So a very broad array of views as to how do we prepare people for the arrival of AGI and what it could mean, but also how do we give people the skills to navigate life in a world where AGI is very present. David.
It was striking that people said STEM is not enough. Science, technology, engineering, and maths is obviously important, but there were a whole bunch of other skills that were highlighted. And interesting that philosophy came in so highly there. Philosophy is no longer seen as just an armchair subject or something for a late night discussion in the pub. It is something that is becoming to the forefront of public debate. One other comment I'll pick up from the detailed responses, there was some skepticism about one of the options we had offered, which was deep AGI literacy among politicians and other leaders. Some people said, this is never going to happen. Look at the shower of politicians we've got. Well, I am a little bit more optimistic than that. I think politicians do take their lead from what the public as a whole are asking about. And if we do what we say we're going to do, which is to raise the caliber of the conversation about AI and AGI, generally, at least some of the politicians will pick this up. And those who don't will probably risk being unelected. So I think politicians will respond, provided we are sharing the right ideas in the first place. And that takes us on to politicians and governments. So what can be done? And I'll start at the bottom of this page, things that there was not strong support for. Little interest in restricting research that would hasten the rise of AGI. That was deemed as being impractical. It wouldn't work. And in any case, it would be detrimental because it will stop all the good things that AGI can deliver. There was little interest in a hands-off approach or in leaving development to market self-regulation. People said, well, of course, the profit-seeking companies have a major role to play in creating better AI. So that shouldn't be hindered and shouldn't be stopped, but it does need to exist within a framework. And the hard thing is figuring out what that framework should be. And there was lots of people saying, this can't be done just locally. Of course, there could be some local experimentations, but there is the danger of a race here. There is a danger that countries will seek to get strong competitive advantage against each other. If they have the first AGI, they will be in a powerful situation. That's why this global governance needs to be truly at the global level. People in the survey were quite clear that this would not be an easy thing. It can be stated easily, but it's much harder to put it into practice. It requires us progressing issues that we haven't been very successful with in the past, such as figuring out what are we going to encourage or discourage, in some cases, prevent companies from doing. We have to fix governance generally of the global economy rather than just fixing the governance of AGI. What can we learn from? There were suggestions that we should look at the most successful institutes that already exist. For example, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is in Vienna, has had reasonable success in controlling the safety of access to nuclear technology. It hasn't been without blemish, but it is something we can learn from. And as well as learning from what's been successful in the past, there is the proposal from within the Millennium Project to accelerate our project to explore in models different possible mechanisms for governing the transition from ANI to AGI. Rather than leaving it to play out in real time, we have to do more scenario analysis of exactly that possibility. And one of the possibilities is that we're never going to agree worldwide to heavy-handed governance, but could we at least be strongly influenced by standards that have been developed in a collaborative but non-prescriptive way? In what happened with many of the internet standards. They were not turned into laws, but they were good enough standards that inspired the world to cooperate. Anything to add, Rohit?
Yeah, so picking up on some of the things you said, the interesting thing about governance is it's not a kind of given that people buy into it. So if you look at things like climate change, we're still struggling to have nations buy in and then act on it. With the Sustainable Development Goals, everyone sees them as a worthy thing now, but they're enacted in very uneven ways across the planet. And so given the potential for AGI to help countries and companies achieve incredible competitive advantage relative to others, you can see the governance issue being gamed and stretched out, or the risk is it's gamed and stretched out over time until you have companies and countries with a really superior positioning, in which case they dictate the governance agenda. Secondly, I think there's a perspective here that actually we may not have one governance institution, we might have a network of them covering different domains. All of these questions then point us back to the question of, well, what is AGI? What do we mean by AGI in order for us to create an effective framework to govern it? And that could be one of those debates that takes longer than it does to actually bring AGIs to market. And then another interesting point here is that calling it AGI actually might be diverting attention from the fact that much of what we're talking about here is already being done and is being advanced quickly through automation and existing narrow AI technologies. And it's slipping in under the radar effectively because we're not putting it under this big banner of AGI. We're not questioning the broader societal impacts of this in the way that we're trying to do with this study. And that maybe we're doing ourselves a disservice by talking about waiting for AGI when we should really be starting the conversation now about the logical extension of what's already going on and preparing ourselves for that, and even retrospectively acting on the things that have happened. So I think there's a number of dimensions to this, and the competitive nature of governance, I think, is something that will really start to play out when nations see just how economically advantaged or disadvantaged they could be by what's going on. And then do we start to see alignment of nations around particular brands of AGI? So does China and its Belt and Road Initiative countries align around one form of AGI versus the EU around another, and the US sort of friendly countries around another? It could be a very interesting time as this plays out, and governance across those different collectives might be quite hard. And finally, let's just look at some of the kind of closing thoughts people gave us that we haven't already touched on. And one is this idea of, well, just because we can doesn't mean we should. And I gave the example of autonomous vehicles. A lot of points about the definition being essential to anything else. And then one of the concerns is that this is likely to be developed by for-profit institutions, and it gives them a major role in society. And the question is how you govern and regulate them when they're so far ahead. And with some people believing they already have forms of AGI in those tech companies, they're just waiting to bring them to market at the right time. The question is how the rest of us keep up with that, and how do we prepare for something that we can't yet see? Also, some interesting questions about, is this something where we can't really think about it in human terms, that our intelligence isn't adequate enough to think about what an artificial general intelligence might do and all the situations in which it might operate? And so, for example, when it's in extreme situations, when it's in situations with where they might be emotionally charged or high levels of sensitivity or volatility, or they're very rare, unique, and risky, we don't really know how the AGIs will respond, because they're not just using training data there, they're learning and adapting. And it's only then that we'll work out, in some cases, how we want to regulate. And then there's that drives us to two things. One is this just a tsunami that we can't control? Whereas we could sort of control the pace of development of the automobile, of aviation, of construction technologies, because we could see them, we could see the advances, whereas all of this is invisible. The data, the algorithms, and the speed at which it's moving is almost uncontrollable. And then does that then lead us towards this idea of, well, maybe we're moving towards augmenting the human brain to cope with this, and moving towards some form of artificial humanity to navigate this? And then the sort of last couple of points is, again, one is, if we're talking about tackling all these problems with technology, the question is, if there's sufficient problems for us to want to tackle, why aren't we dealing with them now? Because almost everything we talk about is there today and could be tackled with the right will, the right investment, and the right desire. And maybe we just don't have the right shared goals to tackle it today, and nor would we with AGI. So it raises some quite fundamental questions. And then two final points. One is this view that people have talked about this being our last great invention. And if it is, then the question is, well, what is humanity's role? How are we inventing humanity's role to go alongside the invention of this great technology? And then finally, a quote that someone shared from Luke Skywalker, which I thought was a great way to end, which says, this is not going to go the way you think. So hopefully that's given some food for thought. David, want to add anything there?
There were lots of fascinating comments in reply to the last two questions in particular, which were what other thoughts have people got at the end of the survey, and what would they recommend we would do in the next phase of this? And I'll just share some of these. People said, well, you could explore the implications of AGI for relations between genders. You know, the relationships between man and woman has been fascinating and problematic throughout history. And maybe we need more women in politics. Maybe that can be altered by AGI. How about exploring that? Other suggestions were that we could break things down a bit more carefully. Instead of asking people to predict when AGI was here, we could ask for simpler predictions, such as when will AI clearly pass the Turing test. And then finally, other people said, well, we weren't thinking big enough. And you've already touched on this, Rohit, by talking about artificial humanity. People were saying AGI is interesting, but the full set of challenges become clear when we look at other changes in human experience and technology at the same time. The quantum computing, the advanced biotechnology, and the brain-computer interface that people like Elon Musk and his company Neuralink are talking about. So we might not only have AIs that are much smarter than today, we might have people that are much smarter than today in the relatively near future. That's other possible work that we could explore.
Great.
I see a couple of questions in the chat pending further feedback in the Q&A. Do you want to explore one of these, Rohit? This is from Peter Haraldsson.
Hello, Peter. Let's start with the first one. I'll throw it at you, and then maybe I'll pick up on the second one. So the first question is, who will bridge the gap while full AGI implementation is taking place, and while we're trying to realize it? Won't the majority of people need a human interface as a navigator?
I think there's a lot in that question, and I'm not sure I'm going to address it exactly as Peter has in mind. But I think we are looking for human guides in this. And a lot of the discussion that we've had so far has been technically interesting, but there isn't a clear leader in the sense what? Greta Thunberg has become a clear leader and a catalyst for discussions about climate, along with people like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Leo, the actor. So maybe we do need to find more spokespeople who can break through in a way that is for all our photogenic qualities neither Rohit nor myself is going to do. So maybe in the future, people talk about Elon Musk as somebody who gets attention on this, but he may not be the right person either. But maybe there is a Greta Thunberg somewhere that can help to put this much more comfortably into the general public's perception.
Yeah, I guess bring it down a level, as well as the big public profile figures, which I think are essential to get it into the dialogue. I think then there's at the kind of practical day-to-day level, whether it's the organizations we work for or the organizations we deal with, we need some form of navigation, and it's not perfect today, whether I'm going into a retailer and physically dealing with them or dealing with them over the phone, or I'm dealing with a tech-based company. The interface is never perfect, the navigation is never perfect, and the resolution of issues is never perfect. So we already have that today with our current generation of technologies. And I think the navigation issue is one more about how we change the design of organizations to really be focused on the end user, the end consumer, the end service recipient, rather than optimizing what we do internally. And I always think that when I deal with call centers and service centers, they have never been designed with me in mind. They've been designed with the internal functional structure to whittle away till they know exactly who to give me to, but not necessarily who's going to own my issue. And I could go through all sorts of stories, but and I think that's the challenge now, is to find that new role, that curatorial role that says, who's going to help me navigate life, the technologies that are coming through, help me understand where I need to know about what the technology does and where I just need to know how to use it. As a simple example, in banking and financial services, today, we already use the technology to enable me to design my own products, my own portfolio, and to add intelligence to my money. So if I have a pound note today, if I put £100 in the bank knows I've given it £100, but those £100 in its account have no idea who owns them. But we can add intelligence to each of those pound notes. And basically, I can parameterize it. I can set rules. And so, for example, I can say to it, look, all day long, I want you to be looking for the best possible interest rate for yourself overnight, where there's no switching costs. And I want you to move to wherever that happens. And I'll give you complete permission to do that. You just have to provide the accounting data back to my Uber AI. That's brilliant for me, but an absolute nightmare for the commercial institutions. Someone is going to need to be the navigator to help me understand how to do that and how to provide it. And again, I don't think it's going to be the institutions themselves, because turkeys don't vote for an early Christmas. That will be something that requires a new institution. Maybe it's the tech providers that, as part of my phone, I'm taught how to do that as one of the apps on my phone. But I think we are going to need that role played. And then, oh, go on.
Well, it's true that many technologies only became successful when there were groups of people, consultants, who understood them well enough and who were credible and reliable enough that they could help others make sense out of them. So open source, for example, that depended on the arrival of consultants such as Red Hat, who became very successful in providing reliable, clear information about open source. I think it's going to be the same with a lot of AGI, not so much just whether people make business success out of it, but how we handle our own emotional feelings about it. There will be a role for communities that can help people in a constructive way to think new thoughts. Of course, this is what futurists have always hoped to do, to help people overcome future shock. But I think we need futurists who understand AGI as never before.
So Peter's asking a lot of good questions here, and they sort of roll around trust. Let me try and roll them all together. Can AGI be masked by another Google that guides you in directions you don't ask for? How do you build trust when the present situation has built total lack of trust in many people? And is this really about how we build trust, David.
Oh, one of these questions is by Tony Hawkins as well. So thanks, Tony.
Hello, Tony.
I think there is a risk that we may think we are getting good advice from whichever our search engine is, whether it's Google or something else. We may hope that we can rely on them, but they are pushing us in directions that aren't good for us. We already probably buy things that we shouldn't buy. We already possibly vote for parties or for causes that we probably shouldn't do because we've been skillfully manipulated. And just putting greater intelligence behind the system doesn't take away the risks of manipulation. So how do we know which group to trust? And I mean, my own view here is this is about politics. It's about democracy. It's about democracy having an understanding of what's going on. And one way we can help is by insisting on more openness. We talked about open source a minute ago, but that's only the start. Pushing things into transparency. As consumers, as pressure groups, we should strongly prefer the organizations that are dedicated to openness rather than keeping things secret. And there is a suggestion in some of the survey responses that we should be prioritizing putting all of the learnings from AI and AGI, all of the intellectual property, into the public domain rather than keeping it. A little bit like Jonas Salk put the polio vaccine into the public domain rather than trying to make huge amounts of money out of it. So we need more people like that. I'm sure you've got thoughts on this as well, Rohit.
Yeah, it's a couple of things. One is at the sort of individual organizational level. I think we are going to see this technology basically being incorporated into the platforms of the dominant tech players, Google, Amazon, and others. Google owned DeepMind. Many people believe DeepMind is the leader, if not one of the leaders in AI research, and probably one of the first to get to genuine AGI. And so I think we could see this stuff just feeding into the applications that serve us, and we'll just be told it's another feature, and we won't even realize it's AGI. And some are saying it's already there in some cases. So I think that'll be one piece that we won't necessarily see its arrival heralded by cakes and champagne corks and things. It will just come. I think that there's another level of this, which is the trust thing really starts to ask questions about when we place trust in a politician, we're really placing trust in their personality more than we are necessarily in their policies. I.e., we trust that person to get the job done rather than trusting that they've got a good policy that will work for us. And that's being challenged in a lot of places. One of the things AGI could do for us is to strip away the personality element and really focus on what is the idea that's being put forward, what is the evidence behind it, what is the opportunity or challenge we're trying to address, and then really allowing people to dig deeper in order to make their decisions and decide how to cast their vote. That in turn relies people to invest the time to do that, and we're not geared up for that at the moment. We're geared up to trust personalities rather than investigate policy on the whole. And so that, I think, requires a big mindset shift, that if we really want to build a trust-based society, then we have to reframe the notion of what we mean by trust and the means by which we build it, and strip it away from personality-centered trust more towards content and context and evidence-based trust. And I think that's a very big journey, and it's certainly not something we're educating for today.
The blockchain community like to say that instead of having to trust humans, we should be able to benefit from trust in mathematics. There's something called a zero knowledge proof, that you don't actually have to know things, but you can still find things out. It's a bit counterintuitive, but I believe there are some genuine insights there. This is part of the decentralized autonomous organizations we briefly touched on before. I don't think this is going to be easy, just as managing AI isn't going to be easy, but I think it's something that we're going to have to get our heads around, so we avoid ending up trusting the wrong people.
I agree. And the great thing about that is, you say, we trust in the maths, we trust in the algorithms, we trust in the code, And that's why they talk about it being a trustless system, in that you don't have to trust in that human or trust in the lawyer who's interpreting the contract. You have a contract, and the transactions either happen or they don't, and the outcomes happen in whatever way have been specified in the contract. So I can see that being a very big part of this going forward. The question is, again, how do we educate people to understand the value of that and to put their trust in, if you like, in a trustless system, rather than still looking for the personality to get behind? Because what we've seen is with certain politicians, and we know full well who they are in the UK, people have trusted their flamboyant personality rather than doing any questioning of the evidence that sits behind their behavior, which in some cases has been incredibly untrustworthy. And so it's that shift in society that I really question whether we'll see it, or more, I encourage us to think about how we get to that.
Well, there was a question that was lurking in the survey itself in the final sections, which maybe I can toss to you on this, Rohit. It follows up. The question was, well, the survey seems very interesting. It's been a great experiment, but how are we actually going to raise the public profile of the findings? What are we hoping, and what could we do to ensure that more people are aware of this set of issues?
Well, so we're going to be pushing this out there and driving the content out, and we want to build the biggest possible dialogue. We want everyone to get involved. We don't want to own the content. We want to get it out there and get conversations going. So I think that's very important. And we want ideas from people about how do we do this? How do we scale it up? Who are the foundations or whatever who might want to work with this to help support the PR piece of this? Because you will need PR to get it into the public dialogue, to get it discussed in the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, and to raise it up the agenda to say, look, this is something that might not come for 5 to 10 years, but it's something we need to be preparing for now, because when it does hit us, it will be a tsunami. One last question. So please feel free to stay. Dave and I will keep chatting for however long you keep asking questions, but do feel free to go. Peter's asked another good question. This was sort of picked up last week. Abundance is key, scarcity is key, as a key element of most business products. So are we looking at the wrong drive? Well, yeah, the point is, if you get true genuine artificial general intelligence, and it is redesigning economic systems and business models for the greatest possible good, and it's creating abundance, then that kind of eliminates most economic models that are scarcity based. And it turns on its head the current thinking about how you generate rent from scarce assets. So yes, it does require some fundamental rethinking of that, which is one of the reasons why I think business hasn't embraced it in the way it could do. And then Tony's asked a question, maybe I'll throw this one at you, David. What do you think of Cathy O'Neill's weapons of mass destruction, criticizing badly made and applied algorithms? David, have you read the book?
It's a fine piece of work. It highlights the ways in which algorithms, which seem to be correct, which seem like we ought to be able to trust them, often end up counterintuitively being prejudiced against people, being prejudiced against groups of people, especially when they cannot be interrogated. So Cathy O'Neill and a few others who have written about this have done a good service in alerting us to the dangers of opaque black box AIs. And that could get worse. The cleverer the software is, if we are not able to understand it, it would be like dealing with a very talented member of your management team. You don't know what drives them. You don't know what tools and methods they're using. You see that they seem to be getting results, and so you trust them more, and then they make a terrible mistake and it's too late. That's the risk of a lot of the algorithms today. It may be prejudiced against people from various racial groups getting the services they need, or attributing them as being more likely to commit crimes. It may stop people getting job offers of various sorts. That's why we need to move towards openness and understanding, and avoid the things that are obscure and difficult to understand.
Which is a fascinating point. If you think about the way most businesses are run, even countries now, we're very much driven by outputs and outcomes. We're driven by the numbers. We reward based on the numbers. So if you hit your profit targets, your revenue targets for the year, your growth targets for key markets, the stock market rewards you, and doesn't ask too many questions about how you got there. Internally, the same is true. We take the big target, we divide it up, we allocate it across the organization, and we try not to know too much about what's really going on at the execution level to get those numbers, which is why you kind of got the crisis we had with subprime, where people at the top knew something was going wrong, but they didn't necessarily know the details of how terrible debt was being packaged up to make it look like good debt. They had some inclination, but they almost said, I don't want to know, thinking that it would never, the problem would never emerge. And that really requires us to turn the system on its head again and to start to think very differently about the role of leadership, and how leaders work with the organization to truly understand how actions are executed and how bold visions and grand strategies are translated into operational action. Because I think quite often people will be surprised at how things are interpreted, how a PowerPoint deck and a fine video end up being translated into desk instructions to someone who's got those revenue targets.
And we've got lots of examples of clever companies bending the rules, appearing to conform to standards, but they're only by means of twisting things, such as the emissions from exhaust from cars. Some people knew about it and others turned a blind eye, others didn't know about it at all. So people can appear to meet the right metrics, but have longer term issues, and that could be even worse with more powerful companies driven by more powerful AI. AI itself could help to keep an eye on things, could help in a trustable surveillance, but it's not going to come into place easily. It's going to take a lot of design and a lot of discussion. We could discuss this for a lot longer. We will be discussing it again on Saturday, which is in 2 days' time. In 2 days and 1 hour's time, more or less, it will be kicking off at 4 p.m. UK. Some of you may feel parts of your head buzzing as a result of this conversation. I know it makes my head buzz and hurt at times. So if you want to chip in again for the continuation of this discussion, when Rohit and I will try a deeper dive in a few areas, then you can register on London Futurists, or indeed, if you're registered for this event, we will automatically register you for Saturday. So that will make it even easier. That's AI working on your behalf. Great.
Well, thank you all for coming. I hope you've enjoyed the session and look forward to seeing some of you at least on Saturday. And as David and I have said, we really do encourage people to put some thought into how do we get the biggest possible conversation going on around this. We don't want to own the conversation. We just want to use this as a catalyst for that broader conversation about how do we prepare for not just AGI, but the deeper impacts of the kind of automation initiatives that are already underway. So
absolutely. Thanks.
Bye now.